Social distancing, you say? The future is watching. Welcome to Opcode Virtual Summit.
All right. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for Matt for putting this together. It's a little weird for me to do sort of online webinar stuff. I've never really liked it, just because I miss having audience interaction. But I think we'll manage. We'll figure out the best way to handle this. I've been particularly vague with Matt about what I was going to present, but I figured that I could keep a few secrets in here and hopefully get to have a nice conversation with everybody and get to drop some interesting stuff. So, I call this something particularly vague, but I think it'll start to make sense. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Juan Andrés Guerrero-Saade. I used to work with Kosten over at Great, and then had a nice stint over at Chronicle with the uppercase research team. And I'm now off doing my own thing in a sort of stealthy way, and also have joined Thomas Ridd over at Johns Hopkins to do a little bit of academic work and hopefully teach a course this summer. The Grug is insisting that I say my name again. I'm just going to keep ignoring him. But in any case, I'm sort of being stealthy about what I'm doing for the time being, but I was hoping that I could still drop some research and hopefully keep things interesting for everybody as we sort of hunker down. So today, we're going to talk about something particularly interesting, at least to me, which is territorial dispute. For those of you that don't know what territorial dispute is, Kim Setter wrote a great article about this back in 2018. Basically, as part of the Shadow Brokers dump, there were a couple of particularly interesting text files that got dumped that were meant to essentially help the equation group operators track different malware that might be on the boxes of the victims that they were cohabitating with. It was a matter of deconfliction. I've written a whole paper about deconfliction and some of the issues therein that you could look into. But in any case, there's this great story by Kim, and what it focuses on is really this paper. So I think Boldy, our beloved Boldy, or Dr. Boldasar Begsath from Crisis Lab, and his team wrote this paper back in 2018, which was a SAS talk about these small text files and essentially the number of sort of signatures and different atomic indicators that were pointing to all sorts of malware or potential malware or suspicious files that equation group operators or NSA operators were keeping track of up to about 2013, as far as we can tell. So there's a lot there, and I really do mean it. There's a lot there. I mean, Boldy did a great job at the time of what they had and identified a great deal of things. But there was a lot that they could not have possibly gotten to. And then as Kosten, as you might have seen in one of Kosten's tweets this morning, as Kosten mentioned, there's still a lot of stuff to be unpacked from here. There's also some work that was done, back with Silas Cutler and I were over at Chronicle. We were able to unearth a couple of things from here. Kaspersky's great team has also discovered a couple of things. So before rushing into just sort of dumping a new threat actor or something new to look at, I was hoping to kind of recap a little bit on some of the stuff that has already been found and some of the interesting observations therein that we might want to consider. So if my setup collaborates with me again, let's see. Oh, here we go. So okay, here we go. So, here's some of the signatures. Basically, sigs.py, which is the sort of main series of numbered signatures that these operators were looking for, has about 45 signatures in it. Some of them are redundant. Some of them are particularly sparse and almost impossible to keep, to dig in further on. Because unlike any more sophisticated anti-malware solution, they basically were just looking for certain combinations of registry keys and file names, which isn't, it really isn't very much to dig on. It also is, of course, limited by the age of the visibility, which is, of course, we can't necessarily be expected to have a whole lot of data or heuristic data going back to 2010, 2011, 12, and so on. But there's a lot of recognizable names. Some of you might already have seen, Flame, Mini Flame, Flame, Sunflower, and Flower Shop relate to a lot of sort of the Gossip Girl super threat actor stuff that Silas Cutler and I worked on recently, which, you can find the video for the talk and a lot of other stuff, papers and everything that we publish. But there's also a lot of fun stuff in there, like, Dark Hotel and Turla, Agent BTZ, Turtle, different versions of that, Animal Farm and Hydra Q and so on. And then there's a few things that kind of stand out, like X4L and some of these question mark signatures that we were able to kind of discover other things on, but we're not going to go into that today. Maybe as opcodes continue, we can drop some tidbits off of different research. And the thing that I was hoping to focus on today is actually this signature 37, which Crisis Lab team has identified as Iron Tiger. And I take some objections with, but we'll go into that in a second. So first of all, I wanted to discuss some of the things that have been identified since the Crisis Lab paper came out. And the first thing that I have to give a lot of credit for, because it's super impressive, was this signature 27 discovery by Kaspersky's great team, where they figured out that it was actually something that they called Dark Universe, or more importantly, a new set of activity or a previously undiscovered set of activity related to Itaduke, a particularly interesting threat actor, not a part of the sort of Russian cloud of dukes, as some folks might assume from the name. It's actually just an unfortunate sort of combination, I believe, between the fact that there were some Italian terms and, I believe the same exploit was used as some of the dukes at the time. I'm sure Kosin could tell you the story better than I can. But in any case, it's a Duke-related framework called Dark Universe, particularly interesting. You can find the report on SecureList. I thought that was a super cool finding that I think highlights the importance of still looking back on some of these signatures and not assume that just because they're old, we have full coverage of whatever's going on there. If anything, we're at a place to kind of test ourselves and figure out if we as threat intelligence providers have been keeping up with at least some partial amount of the visibility that SIGINT giants seem to have. Another thing that I wanted to point out is actually the driver list. The driver list file, which is also pointed out by the Crisis Lab report, is particularly interesting, but it has not really gotten quite as much attention as you might expect. So I wanted to kind of point this one out. I think driver list file, I probably should have included a bigger screenshot here, but in any case, the driver list file, what's interesting about it is it's just meant to point out names of kernel drivers alongside instructions for what the operator should do if and when they encounter this on a box that they're on. And I think that that's particularly interesting, considering that you can see some of the internal classifications for this file. So part of the reason that I say that it's so significant is if you think about how the Shadow Brokers leak worked, a lot of the context and the ability to describe what was going on there came from the fact that, Great had already discovered the equation group back in 2015 and published on it. So they were benefiting from having context already out there. Otherwise, equation group toolkit, super massive, a lot of different, very intricate pieces, takes a lot of work to reverse engineer, to get through, to hunt through. And I'm pretty sure there's still a lot of it that has been discovered since 2015 that it still has not been publicly detailed. So it would have been actually quite difficult, I think, for the Shadow Brokers to convey their message without having that context. However, had they been particularly conservative, I think that just dropping the driver list file would have actually been enough to burn a significant portion of the equation group toolkit. And the reason that I say that is you can actually see a lot of the file names for some of the kernel components of the equation group stuff alongside NSA cryptonyms, which I think is, particularly tough, but also very interesting for anybody who's trying to kind of correlate this activity and understand how some of the leaks and some of the independently private sector discovered components actually correlate. There's some interesting stuff in here that you can see from some of the original reports alongside some of these file names and, of course, some of the versioning. And, you can go sort of play academic and write a fairly interesting thesis, I think, between all the stuff that's been made public and all the stuff that was sort of independently discovered in time, right? Whether it's Anti's report or Kaspersky or some of the other folks that have waded in there. Other stuff that I think is particularly interesting is some of the understanding of how some of these threat actors know one another or might be aware of one another. One particular case is in the driver list. There's sort of a description of what they refer to as friendly tools, which are significant in that they're different from things that seem to have internal, code names. So in this particular case, this mnmdf.sys is actually correlates to Gold Lambert, which I think is, sort of an interesting threat actor in its own right. There's also another instance of this same sort of friendly tool that correlates to another component of Gold Lambert. But there's also some nuances there. They're not aware of other components of the Lambert's toolkit. So there's conversations to be had about sort of the complexities and nuances of how different threat actors, even within, maybe the same alliances or same countries, are aware of one another. And of course, I've written on some of this stuff. You can go read a fairly dry and boring academic paper about it. And then I think that there's still some mysteries within the driver list. This one is one that I'm particularly fond of. And, maybe if my Black Hat talk ends up going through, which I suspect might not happen, I'll get to drop some of this. Otherwise, maybe Matt might have me back, or we'll find some other forum to discuss some of the more interesting stuff. You can see a brief flash of, my latest tattoo honoring some of these findings. I like to wear them on my sleeve. So, okay, let's focus on the new stuff, right? So that was sort of a whirlwind tour of everything that's happening with territorial dispute and Teddy and so on. And it's particularly interesting, I think, as a social phenomenon and as just a general sort of understanding of threat actors behind the scenes. But that's not what everybody's here for, I would imagine. So let's talk about something a little more concrete and hopefully newer. So Signature 37 is discussed as or described as Iron Tiger or ASPX spy. If you look at what Signature 37 originally entails, it's really quite this simple. It's just godown.dll as an atomic indicator, just the name of a file. And you can understand how that is a particularly sparse indicator, but thankfully in this case, it's a fairly unique file name. So it is something to dig on. Now, the reasoning behind Crisis Lab pointing to Iron Tiger or ASPX spy for Signature 37 is this particular file from VirusTotal that they included in their report. And I imagine that, they mustn't have had a great deal of time to dig into quite so many operations. So no fault to Crisis Lab on this one. But in this case, I think that the identification is wrong. If you look at what that particular file is on VirusTotal, you can see right away there's a couple of things that kind of should tell some of the more seasoned threat hunters that this isn't a particularly good lead to go on. For one, the file name sort of indicating that this is some kind of dump, memory dump, and also that it's a massive file. 15 megabytes for an executable is quite big. But also, if you're particularly astute, you can also catch the fact that the file name starts with mcshield.exe. To me, that looks like maybe somebody was trying to dump some of the signature or basis for McAfee's antivirus and might have stumbled upon some things there. So what the dump ends up doing is, if you look at the community comments, someone, Venom23, I think that might be Florian Roth, I'm not entirely sure, had matched this under an Iron Tiger ASPX spy rule and, sort of auto-commented that onto the VT community section. And I suspect that, Crisis Lab folks sort of took that to the report as they didn't necessarily have a lot of time to dig into it. However, this is a false positive insofar as while the rule might be right and it might be matching a binary that includes those indicators, that same binary includes tons of indicators because it's actually based on a series of antivirus bases that were sort of taken out of context of McAfee installer. And that includes the godown.dll file name, but this is not, what we should be looking at. This actually does not identify the cluster of activity we should be looking at here. So let's go back, to the drawing board, go back to scratch, just, throw out that notion that it might be Iron Tiger or Lucky Mouse or Emissary Panda or whoever, and instead just go right back to godown.dll and start hunting fresh. So when we do that, we actually are able to narrow in on a different set of files. And as you can see here from VT, this is sort of entirely undetected, DLL. This one in particular shows up a couple of years ago, but in general, the activity is much older than that. And is sort of a promising lead for us to kind of kick off on. When we start digging deeper into this particular DLL, what we find is something I think particularly interesting. Obviously, a sort of self-description of this go down module, hence the name of the talk. In reality, there's a lot of sort of weird comm stuff that's happening with this particular DLL. And as we start hunting on some of these and some of these particular SIDs and some of the stuff on the screen right now, writing some YARA rules and so on, what we dig out onto is actually a much larger cluster of activity. And not just the go down DLL, but rather go down DLL as a drop from a multi-stage framework that's been sort of built by this threat actor. It starts with this gpupdates.exe. In reality, this is a SIP to secure executable, which is sort of this Chillcat application from back in the day that you could essentially basically tell it to pack all these things for you and place them where they needed to be and execute a particular smaller exe that would take care of placing all these different things and executing things for you. So in reality, gpupdates.exe is the first stage that includes all this other stuff. You can see the configuration here from SIP to secure, where it's basically telling it encrypt all this stuff, decrypt it when you execute, and pull out this distribute.exe that's really just going to distribute all the components onto the system. And then some particular things that interestingly happen there. There's a lot of sort of registration of these different DLLs as these OLE services in the system. For some of you that are being particularly astute, you can start to tell that this is targeting some fairly old versions of Windows. More on that in a bit. And then there's a sort of main orchestrator, which is being made persistent as a Windows service called EY service. Of course, it has its own fake description and all this interesting stuff to hopefully not arouse suspicion. The components that are being dropped and that are being used in the process are a series of DLLs. Some of them are just straight up commodity stuff or really commonly available resources that are being, I don't know whether they're being abused or reused. Some of them are obviously being abused, like the first one, that lame ENC. It's really a UPX packed version of the MP3 library, or basically your standard MP3 or WAV library. It's just been UPX packed and thrown in there. Interestingly, they're repurposing that to use that for the purposes of turning on a hot mic. There's also what seems to be a slightly more popular keylogger that they're including in there. They're also abusing this sort of strange bitmap creation DLL from some kind of gaming forums to actually take screenshots, which I think is quite creative, but also sort of an interestingly crappy level of development at the same time. And yet, you see those first three components where you clearly go, well, this isn't a very sophisticated or capable threat actor or developer involved. And yet you see some of the file management stuff is actually being done in this strange type library way, and so is the command and control stuff. So I think if you're looking for some of the more sophisticated components of this, or some of the more interesting components of this, svchost.exe, go down DLL, and filesystem.dll seem to include some new tricks, while at the same time they're packing some fairly old and wonky stuff that they're using to do new stuff. Most of the control that's going on in this sort of very convoluted, ginormous switch statement that just takes about 17 or 18 numbered commands, which then orchestrate all sorts of different functionality. As you can tell, some of the stuff is not fully implemented here. There's definitely a certain level of development. I say, as you can tell. I mean, for those of you that are, very staring at the screen quite intently, you can still see that there are about 3 or 4 different commands that haven't been implemented. You might also be able to tell that I'm not a fantastic reverser either. So there are still a lot of mysteries in here that I encourage any of you with greater skill to take the time and go into. Moreover, I haven't even been able to properly parse out the IP that it's using for command and control because it just stumps me. So feel free to go in there and do some proper debugging. And I think you'll find some things that I've yet to find. Among those, I think if I can encourage others to get involved in the research and get interested, I think that there's some particular oddities. First and foremost, there's this sort of type library com control weirdness that they're doing with the go down and file system DLLs. I say that it's weirdness because I've actually not seen anything similar implemented in other malware descriptions so far. So it does seem to be like they're doing some strange, sort of ActiveX com type library strangeness in order to control some of these components. There's also another component that gets dropped further on, which is a particularly curious choice of packet sniffer. So if you look at some of the functionality deeper down, they're dropping this thing called psSDK41.vxd or .sys, and that's actually this old school microlab packet sniffer SDK driver, which is actually sort of a precursor to TCP dump. And I point out sort of that I think it's particularly interesting within the context of Teddy because it's also included within the driverless file, as I have mentioned. So once again, I think that this is a piece of malware that was found sort of in the wild, in the field, and had already been deployed. And if you look at the driverless file, once again, you actually see a series of other names for other versions of the same packet sniffer. And I got a little curious and started sort of digging around on some of these. And it turns out that some of the other versions actually correlate to other versions of this go down malware, or what I refer to as the Nassar APT. If you look at psSDK 3.1 instead of the 4.1 we were looking at, we've actually found at least one other sample from 2010 that is dropping that version of the packet sniffer. So it seems like, at least for some of the operations that the equation group, operators were running into or conflicting with, there might have been a tree of development or development over time that they had been able to witness in the wild. Now, of course, what everybody wants to know when it comes to these things is, what's the attribution? I'm fairly attribution agnostic, though I don't really want to parse terms or just sort of tiptoe around anything. So let's just present some of the tiny fragments and tidbits that we can put in there. And I'm sure that people with greater visibility will be able to put things together in a more interesting way going forward. But first and foremost, and I think this is the most important part from the perspective of sort of threat intel research, rather than attribution, clustering. I've been unable to cluster this to any publicly reported group so far. Of course, if it is something that can be connected to some other group, fantastic. Please let us know. For the time being, I haven't been able to do it, which I think again validates the importance of going back to some of these old scriptures, if you will, and still try to compare notes and try to figure out what mysteries we've yet to uncover. In this particular case, I can at least say that it's a previously undiscovered cluster of activity. Who knows if it's connected to anything else? Now, for the kind of stuff that people like, there are some debug resources that have been left in there including some Farsi resources and some of the droppers and some of the go down DLLs themselves. Also, a debug path, which I think is particularly interesting for this particular term that you could see as sort of the root path. So I went ahead and I asked some friends that are native Farsi speakers and who might be able to help. And what they pointed me to was this KHZER as a transliteration of the term Nazar. And Nazar, has several meanings, but it could be taken either as to survey or to monitor. More practically, it's also the name for some of these sort of evil eye protection amulets, which I particularly liked. So that's why I'm referring to this threat actor or this cluster of activity as the Nazar APT. And it might also be the first APT that actually has an emoji already set within your iOS keyboard. So, if you feel like chatting on it, that's particularly useful. Now, another thing that I think is particularly interesting is that the victims appear to be exclusively within Iran. At first, lacking any visibility of my own, I was sort of basing myself on the fact that the most perfect drop versions of the orchestrator payload were exclusively submitted from Iranian machines to VirusTotal, which I will be the first person to tell you is not a good way to do victimology. So I wasn't going to mention that at all. However, two collaborators that will remain nameless for the time being have actually pointed me at some of their own visibility and been able to share that there were exclusively victims in Iran. And interestingly, and I say this particularly because the malware is so old and it targets such old versions of Windows XP and down, there's still a few victims beaconing out of Iran for this. So I think it's particularly interesting. I say that it's particularly interesting since we're discussing attribution because, whenever anybody talks about Iran as an attacker, we start to think about sort of Western victims and all the things that we've seen with your usual oil rig ops or, whatever. Trying to think, the name has literally escaped me at this time. I was thinking Rasgas and Saudi Aramco, but Kosin will be able to correct me for not remembering the name in this particular moment. In any case, whenever we think about Iranian APTs, we tend to think sort of Western targeting. Whenever we think about Iranian targeting, we tend to think sort of Western APTs. In this particular case, if we were to take all of the attributed indicators at face value, it sort of defies that general perception insofar as looking at what may be an Iranian-born cluster of activity targeting what looks like exclusively Iranian victims. But of course, please, take that all with the 10 spoonfuls of salt that it requires under the circumstances. That said, it's not something entirely beyond the pale. You could look at something like Ator, for example, on other sort of domestic surveillance toolkits as a sort of particularly interesting trend there. So there is some precedent for it, but I'm just saying it's sort of based on very sparse data, so I don't necessarily want to harp on that in particular. Now, the whole point of this is to arouse sort of the interest of other researchers. I really mean this. I'm very fortunate in my personal life. There's a lot of different new ventures and things going on that I'm focused on that I'm very excited about. But it also means that despite being locked within my home, I don't necessarily have all the time in the world, and I definitely don't have all the visibility in the world to take on this kind of work with the kind of sort of full-time focus that I think it deserves. So the whole point of this is not just to show off, but rather to show off and hopefully arouse the interest of other researchers to get involved and dig in and see, a new cluster of activity and hopefully feel motivated to jump in. So for those of you that are interested, well, you're going to have to badger me a bit because I have every intention of publishing this on my blog. But I am still finishing the draft today. And, if you don't see it by the end of the day, please feel free to harass me on Twitter. But I have every intention of publishing YARA rules and IOCs and everything that you'll need to sort of trace some of my steps and hopefully find some stuff of your own. In particularly, any particularly skilled reversers, please jump in, figure out what the packet sniffer is doing in particular, figure out what some of this other functionality within the 17, 18 other commands within that switch statement, are that I've yet to document fully, and figure out what this type library technique is that I have not figured out and that I don't think has been publicly reported so far. So yeah, sky's the limit. You're absolutely welcome to contribute. Again, epicturla.com. It'll eventually be there. Please feel free to badger me for it. And that is that. So I don't know if there have been comments in the chat. I've tried not to read. I find the Grug and Kosin just distracting enough on the chat here in the speaker's room. But I don't know if Matt wants to come back with any questions. I'm just trying not to look. I'm trying not to get too distracted, as I go through the slides. But I'm getting phone calls. There's several chats going on, text messages. I'm all over the place. All of the stuff that I put forward is on VirusTotal. I have not checked in Teaser or Malshare or Virus Bay or any of the other that are available at this time. If anybody wants to extend any particular access to me as an academic and independent researcher right now, they're more than welcome to. I do believe Malshare has a lot of the samples already, which is great initiative on the part of Silas Cutler. But yes, all of the samples that I have mentioned and will mention are on VirusTotal, so there's no excuse apart from basic access to VT not to look at the stuff.
And another question was, are you going to share all the hashes and bytes? I guess it's going to be in your blog post, right? The one you're finishing now, right?
It will be on my blog post. Again, feel free to badger me if you don't see it by the end of the day. I've just been polishing up the draft. I think having Kosin as a mentor has forced me to be a little more discerning about my own writing, and it's starting to get in my way because I'm just not publishing. So I need to maybe sit back and just dump the blog post already. But yeah, there will be hashes and there will be Yara rules as well.
And well, another question from Kostin was, is this like SIG37 stuff related to Voyeur?
I am not entirely certain. I did not find any immediate correlation, but I didn't focus on Voyeur in particular. So I'm happy to discuss it further.
Okay.
Also, let me just say, for people who do decide to kind of jump in on this, I'll more than happily update the blog and refer to everybody else's work. I'm just trying to kind of throw the inkling out there for others to go hunting, since I don't think anybody's caught on to this activity yet.
Okay. And another question from Devetel was, is this GoDropper friendly to equation group or not?
It is not. So the interesting division here is stuff that's in the driver list is all mixed up. It includes equation tools, it includes equation friendly tools, it includes unknown tools, it includes what they call PSPs or personal security products, so McAfee, Kaspersky, and so on. It even includes things like Nero from back in the day. I think this is a sort of pre-kernel driver code signing paradigm where they were just sort of scared of the possibility of any rootkit cohabitating with them. Mm-hmm. So the driver list just includes everything. On the other hand, the numbered signatures, as far as we can tell, are exclusively, other, I won't say enemy APTs, because there's others that you might consider Western friendlies, like, Animal Farm. But they are definitely separate clusters of activity that include sort of, your usual Russians and, South Koreans, North Koreans, and so on. So I expect signature 37 to be one that they were keeping track of, not one that they were keeping part of.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because some of the files were DRV files, right?
Sorry?
Some of the files were DRV files, which is like, I haven't seen any of that in a long time.
Yeah, they had some XVD stuff in there. Sys, I mean, it's old school too. I mean, the activity, as far as I can tell, is centered somewhere between 2010 to 2013. But there's definitely also several versions of development, and all the samples that I've seen have gone from some portion of incompleteness to some lesser portion of incompleteness. So I expect this activity to have continued to go on, which is why I'm particularly interested to see what others will find as they go forward, because I don't think that this has subsided. If anything, this is a super old school version. I'm sure there've got to be some, Vista and forward Windows versions.
Yeah, very likely. Well, thanks for joining us today and for your presentation. It was really cool. And yeah, if you cannot make it to Black Hat, we'll be more than happy to have you here. I've seen DEF CON is already talking about being cancelled, so maybe it's time to for people to get ready to alternatives.
Yeah, I appreciate the forum.
Actually, there's one more question from Dave. Does have a real rootkit in here or just the sniffer driver?
There is no rootkit in here. It's all userland stuff, except for the packet sniffer. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks again. And talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.